Старт.
Good morning. Is everyone with us? Do you hear us? Yes? Okay. It is my pleasure to introduce today's session, a discussion session on using mathematics and computer science in evolutionary biology. We have a rather unusual discussion panel today, which involves a proper biologist, an ecologist, Professor Niels Christian Stenset from Oslo, his colleague physicist working largely in geology, by the way, Anders Malte Sorensen, and myself, a crystal chemist, Artem Oganov, working here in Moscow at Skoltech, using evolutionary methods for chemical and material science problems. Let me just give you a very brief introduction into the biographies of our panelists. Niels Christian Stenset got his first degree in 1972 at the University of Oslo, majoring in biology, zoology, and mathematics. It's an interesting mix because at that time I think very few people connected zoology and mathematics. He obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree in 1978. Is it correct? And then was appointed a professor of population ecology and zoology at the University of Oslo in 1980. He is one of the highly cited researchers by the Institute of Scientific Information within the fields of ecology and environment. He was vice president and president of the Norwegian Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters from 2009 to 2014. He still is a visiting scholar of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and is a member of several prestigious scientific academies, such as Royal Norwegian Academy of Sciences and Letters, French Academy of Sciences, and Academia Europaea, and has an honorary degree at the University of Antwerp. His research was to a large extent connected to models of evolution, and in particular he's famous for the Red Queen hypothesis, which I think he will mention today. He has a number of awards, such as the ECI Prize of the International Ecology Institute, and the Chinese Science and Technology Cooperation Award, which is actually a very, very prestigious award. Okay, and our second panelist is Professor Anders Malte Sorensen. He got his PhD in physics at the University of Oslo in 1998. He is a group leader in physics of geological processes. He has supervised 15 PhD students, published 5 papers in Nature, 2 in PNAS. These are top journals. And he has also written several internationally best-selling textbooks and actively participates in education. And myself, Artem Oganov, I also have 5 Nature papers, 2 science papers. I am a highly cited Russian researcher, so not yet the global, but within Russia, I am highly cited researcher. And what else do I have? I am a member of Academia Europaea. And let me skip all the other stuff I will mention a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and fellow of American Physical Society. Okay, I think that's enough. Okay. So the title of the session is Using Mathematics and Computer Science in Biology, but we have only one biologist and one physicist/geologist and one physicist/chemist, one /geologist, myself. I'm also doing some geological stuff, but of a different type of geological research. Since the title is largely biological, I would like to give the introductory words to Niels Stenset.
Thank you very much, Artem. I'm very happy to be part of this, and I'm very happy to be entertaining a discussion with scientists from different fields, all of whom are using mathematics to understand the processes they are studying. Evolutionary biology was established as a scientific field by Charles Darwin in 1859. Darwin, he never wrote mathematics, but he had a very mathematical thinking. If he had been sitting together with a mathematician, I'm sure there would have been equations coming out of those conversations. Short or at the turn of the century, in 1900, Mendel was rediscovered. So that was the establishment of genetics. And for a period of about 10 or 20 years, mutation and genetics was seen as a competing theory to evolution through natural selection, that is Darwinism. Today it's very hard to understand that, but they were actually competing. And then in 1930, so just before, the genetics and evolution was brought together by mathematics. Ronald Fisher, he can be called the founder of modern evolutionary theory, and he wrote mathematics. By the way, he established the theory of, or the new synthesis as it is called, and modern statistics. So this man did two things. Fantastic person, must have been. He was a bit arrogant, but he was smart. Together with J.B.S. Haldane and other British scientists, also using quite a bit of mathematics. So it was mathematics and mathematic thinking around population dynamics, how individuals are interacting within a population, and that's basically a mathematical. You have to do mathematics in order to understand it properly. Haldane and Fisher and others, they brought evolution and genetics together, and that is called the new synthesis. They brought it together by developing models that some genotypes were doing better than other genotypes, and that is selection. That is natural selection. Then in 1972, ecology had been a very descriptive field. It became also a more theoretical field, and that was through mathematics. Robert MacArthur in Princeton, and by the way, later on came Robert May. They brought mathematical thinking into ecology. Again, made out a dynamic field based on proper theoretical analysis. So today, it's impossible to think about evolutionary biology and ecology as a field without mathematics. Then I would like to add one more point, and this is statistics. We are getting an increasing amount of data now. Modern technology facilitates us getting all sorts of data. And to understand the structure of these data, we need to use statistical modeling. And it has been my experience that if you do statistical modeling by having models based on mathematical model and then asking the real world, that is the data, the question, what the structure is, it is much more helpful. I remember only a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, I was doing some dengue, the disease, and we had some data. And a colleague of mine had done some statistical analysis, time series analysis, autoregressive analysis. And it was totally impossible to understand anything. There was no biology there. So I said to my colleague, that could you please give me a course in population biology of dengue? And we were flying from Inner Mongolia to Beijing. And during that trip, he gave me a course. And then I formulated a mathematical model that we could use as the base for a statistical model. 1 year after, it ended up in a paper in PNAS. By the way, being followed up by another paper 1 year later. So again, the interaction between mathematics and statistics is essential. That's what I would like to say by way of introduction to this the conversation between the three of us.
Yes, yes, but it's yes, Anders. Would you like to say something?
I'd like to say something about the connection between statistics, data, and modeling in some sense. And one of the large, I would say, revolutions in physics, maybe that's a hard word, but it was essentially the coupling of the microscopic realm to the macroscopic realm through the theory of what we call statistical mechanics. So the nice thing about statistical mechanics is that you start with a microscopic view, like the world is made of individual atoms. And of course, if you just stare at atoms, it's a very frustrating experience, because it's very hard to learn anything from that. You learn something as soon as you change your perspective. You go outside or further away from the system. But in order to do that, you need to develop new concepts to describe what happens on larger scales. And I think this is something where mathematics and let's say physics and chemistry can help, and probably have helped biology to develop those concepts and to use those concepts to analyze what we observe. And sometimes this is often under-communicated, that these concepts are, in physics, they typically appear on many different scales. There's almost never sort of a first scale in some sense. You always explain things by going to a lower scale in order to try to explain things. And this is what we would call an explanation or an understanding in physics. And I'm really curious as to how this is developing in biology in general, and also in ecology. What do you call understanding, or what do you call sort of an explanation of something you observe? And are there concepts and ideas that we might transfer from, let's say, physics, chemistry, or mathematics that are useful when you want to understand or explain what you see on the large scale? So I think some of these things would be interesting to address a bit more in depth in this discussion.
We also have the issue of micro and macro. What I was referring to earlier, that Darwin, and followed up by Fisher and Holden and others, is really what we properly should call microevolution, evolution within a species. So some individuals are better fit to the environment. By the way, the environment is partly the physical environment and partly the biological environment, the other individuals in the population. That is microevolution, and we understand this pretty good today. What we do not understand is at the macro level, extinction and speciation. As a matter of fact, although Darwin's book was called On the Origin of Species, we don't understand how new species are originate. And this is really two different scales. What goes on within a population can be used as a platform for understanding what goes on at higher level, or do we need additional concepts? Do we need additional theories or components of the theory at a higher level? And we don't know that yet today. I'm working on that, and I'm working on that with a following sort of null hypothesis, that we can understand what goes on at higher level, extinction and speciation, on the basis of lower level processes that is within population. Now, I'm doing that now together with a mathematician. I did some work back in 1984 together with John Maynard Smith on evolutionary biology. And we weren't able to actually move forward on this because we weren't smart enough mathematicians. And I wasn't able to sort of attract a good mathematician. And then I got a good colleague of mine, Jan Norbotten, mathematician. He got I got him interested in this. What happened was that he was giving a lecture on expansion and contraction of oil reservoir. I'm not interested in oil reservoir. But I was the president of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters at the time. And when you're the president of the academy and you have to thank the speaker afterwards, you can't fall asleep during the talk. You have to watch, even though you are not really interested. And I looked at this, and I looked at the equation, and I saw his equation for the oil expansion and contraction is exactly my equation, or they're very, very close to my equation. So I wrote him a mail during the lecture and saying, Jan, can we meet afterwards? And we did. And sort of now we are working on these different scales, trying to understand extinction and speciation on the basis of what goes on within the populations.
By the way, I wonder if these processes of extinction and emergence of new species, if they could be modeled using models and theories used for modeling phase transitions in solids. It's quite possible because often when you have large statistical ensemble, the transitions from one state to another happen suddenly. They're very abrupt. So when you look at changes from of the state of molecular kind of matter, they are usually spread out. You have a lot of statistical weights given by, for example, Boltzmann distribution. But when you go to the solid state, you don't have these smeared out things. You have an abrupt phase transition. Statistics of the large statistics drive you to that. And I wonder if this kind of transition from, let's say, monkeys to humans could be described by these kind of theories.
I never thought about it this way, but I do believe there are partly continuous evolutionary changes through history, and then also some abrupt changes, such as new groups are coming on board. And again, we don't understand that. That's part of what we are trying to understand. I mean, there's a huge field of course. What we are working directly on is really whether evolution proceeds continuously or in steps. Suddenly punctuation, that it stays constant and then suddenly change to another state and then stay constant and suddenly change. It is the assumption, but we don't know. It is the assumption that if there are mainly the physical part of the environment that drives evolution, it is most likely to stay constant for a long time, and then when physical condition comes to a break point, suddenly something happens, and big turbulence within the biological community. But you have to remember, and this you refer to my work on the Red Queen. The Red Queen, if I may, I say a few words about that. The Red Queen really, Alice in Wonderland, this is the history of all Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland was told that in order to not be lagging behind, you have to run as fast as you possibly can. Lee van Welen, back in 1972, he emphasized that most of any individual's environment are other individuals of the same species or other. So if I, as a species, are improving my adaptation to the environment, including the other species, the other individuals of the other species have to evolve in order to stay equally fit. So it's a continuous race here. No mathematical model was really made for this before John Maynard Smith in 1975, and then later we together in 1984, where we asked the question, will this continuous evolutionary race between all the species, will it lead to continuous evolution or will it settle down? Our answer in 1984 was that to this or question, yes, it will depend on the ecological interaction between the competing species or the interacting species, not only competing, but interacting species. But the model was very abstract, so it's very hard to interpret what kind of ecological interaction would give one or the other. Later, together with this mathematician I was referring to, Jan Nordbotten, we were able to move this a little bit forward, because if all the interaction within the ecological system among the species are symmetrical, evolution will settle down at one stable state. Whereas if it is asymmetric, that is, one species are affecting the other more than the reverse one, then the more asymmetry, the more likely is continued evolutionary evolution. And we see this in predator-prey system. We see this in parasite-host system. That's where we have the empirical examples, asymmetry again. So we are moving forward on that. And again, this would be impossible without mathematical modeling. Absolutely impossible.
Niels, but here is a question. Imagine a pair, predator and prey. Let's say wolf and rabbit. Wolf runs faster, and in order to survive, the rabbit has to run faster still. But at some point, they will have to stop the race when they reach speed of light, for example.
Yeah, but that's disagreeing. The two species are disagreeing. The rat want to be sure that it is difficult for the wolf to get it, whereas the wolf will evolve so as to make it easier for the wolf to catch the rabbit. So there's a tension here. And again, I'm doing a paper with some other mathematicians. This is not easy. We can even have in an ecological varying system, we can have fixed strategies that they agree on. Again, mathematics is essential. Without mathematics, it will be absolutely impossible.
But what I'm saying is that if you work on one quantity, such as speed of running, sooner or later you will reach the physical limit. Physical limit, okay, speed of light is a physical limit, but also before that, the strength of muscles and strength of joints will give in.
But there's no such thing as a free lunch in biology. If you are improving in one aspect, it will also always have a cost on some other elements. So you might be better able to run, but you might be less able to reproduce. So it will come at a cost, trade-off, we refer to it.
So the fact that we have not just one fitness quantity, but many of them, such as reproduction ability, speed, stamina, and so on and so forth, and brain capacity, that means this process...
We really refer to this as different traits, different trait axes, and of course you move around in trait space, multidimensional trait space.
Multidimensional.
You move around, and each species moves around in that, and the other species moves around in that, and they somehow try to adapt to each other so as to maximize their fitness on the expense of the others, and everybody do that.
Niels, I'd like to return to one of the things that Artem brought up, this issue of phase transitions, because in physics and in chemistry, what we often see in phase transitions are these type of sudden changes in some sense. Yes, so an intrinsic property of a system that's going through a phase transition is exactly that you have periods where nothing happens, and then suddenly you can have a burst of activity. And this is not due to anything external, it's sort of an internal part of the dynamics of the system. And also in geology, in geoscience, we often have this tendency to explain something we observe in one system. It's due to some external fluctuation, which is sort of generated. It's like where do earthquakes come from? Well, you have large variations in the sizes of earthquakes, and it's probably due to internal dynamics of the earthquakes. It's not like an external event that generated a really large earthquake. And there's been a similar type of development in theory of punctuated equilibrium, I think, where it's also been argued that these sort of large fluctuations that you suddenly see, that they can actually be due to the internal dynamics that you do not need in any external explanation. But of course, now as we're getting better data, maybe we are able to settle more of these discussions.
But actually, for the phase transition to happen, there are some interesting physical aspects here. For the phase transition to happen within, let's say, a population, the population has to be strongly linked within itself. If you have individuals which are non-interacting, a phase transition is not going to happen. For example, what you can consider a phase transition, and people actually are using these concepts of phase transitions, this series of phase transitions to model such things. For example, the pandemic. If we are isolated humans, not interacting with each other, I can be sick or healthy, but this does not affect the whole population. If we talk to each other, if we meet each other, if we are a crowd, like in a big city, then the spread of infection can be modeled using theories of phase transitions, such as renormalization group theory. So if a population of whatever wolves or rabbits or whatever is strongly linked to within itself, then the evolution of this species to a new species could be also perhaps modeled as a phase transition.
And of course, individuals within a species are always interesting because they tend to have a similar food and they tend to reproduce together. So there is all sorts of, and they tend to hide away together. So there's all type of interaction there to adapt to the environment being largely other similar species to them. I think this is actually, this phase transition is a very interesting topic, and it might be worth addressing now in some sort of more detail. Anders was referring to data, the amount of data. So now we are it's fantastic to be a biologist today. It probably is fantastic to be a scientist of almost any kind today because of technology. And in biology, we have many of the concepts there, but we haven't been able to link them as good, as close as we should to data, to the real world, to the real system. With the amount of data that comes now on all sorts of aspects of the biology, including genomics, but also behavioral. They put radio collars and radio transmitters in animals and record what they are doing so that we can actually get to understand why they are doing, why in bookmark they are doing that. So now statistics of various kind, including machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the like, can be used, I think, in order to understand better how the real world are operating. So this is a fascinating time to be a biologist, to be a scientist today.
Could I ask something more there, Nils? Because you mentioned that you start actually to get data on the individual level, that you might be able to collect almost individual level data for individuals, which is rather different than collecting population size data. And this sort of connects to what Artem was mentioning, that if you have individual level data, then you might actually start to uncover how the dynamics of how individuals interact. Of course, you know much of this. I mean, you know much of that interaction. But what we often would like to do is to sort of to simplify it into what is sort of the simplest form of that interaction. So in phase transition, for instance, what you're looking for is that you're looking for what type of symmetry in the interaction between two individual agents is important. And you try to figure out it's this particular factor that's important. And then you group them into classes of universality that depend on these type of interactions. So you find that some materials, they have one type of phase transition, and that depends on sort of this individual type of interaction. Like Unsager solved the Ising magnet, which is sort of the most famous model and the only model we can solve exactly in more than one dimensions in physics and chemistry. And there it was just a very simple sort of binary interaction. You could be turned on or off in some sense, and you were interacting depending on whether your neighbor was turned on and off. And that's one class, university class. And then there is a different class, which is sort of dependent on whether you have like not only on and off, but whether you have many degrees of freedom or continuous degrees of freedom. So, and often in what we can bring there, I think, from let's say physics or mathematics, is this concept of dividing. You take the data, you analyze the details of that dynamics, and then you can suggest that there are various classes that behave differently. And then you can go look for what are then the differences in the individual interactions, if you can use a word like interaction in biology. So here I think there are many interesting concepts, and they come to light when you have data on individual interactions in some sense. And that opens a new box of possibilities.
Since the beginning of the 70s, they have been putting radio transmitters on all sorts of species. I was early on in a study on lemmings in Point Barrow, northern US, northern Alaska, with radio collars on them. And at the time, we could really only analyze them by asking the question and answering how any individual is using space, home range type of system. We never really asked the question, how are the various individuals having radio transmitters on? How are they spacing themselves out or aggregating within? This was partly because of, although we had radio transmitter on several individuals, it was nevertheless few. We were talking about some 10 individuals or 12 or 20 individuals within a population of 100. Now the capacity is much better. And including we can put radio transmitters that observe other things also, whether they are sleeping, whether they're not sleeping, what kind of health condition they are, the heartbeat, etc., etc. So now we are in a position to ask and answer questions: why, in quote mark, are individuals taking the decision? And I believe, but that needs to be proven, of course, I need that they take the decision so as to, in the long term, maximizing their fitness and the current condition. But we don't really know that. Now we are in a position where we can answer that question. We can furthermore ask, are there any species that are able to take one step back in order to take two steps forward later on? I'm sure some individuals, some species are able to do that. Maybe we people are able to do that. I'm not quite sure about that when I look upon the behavior of people around me. But at least we believe that we are able to think in the long term, so as to take one step back in order to take two steps forward later on. Which individuals are doing that? Which species are doing that? That's a very interesting question. Could I go back to the term transition? John Maynard Smith and Urs Schottmary from Hungary, two very interesting people, they got to work together. One was working on behavioral ecology. That was John Maynard Smith. Urs Schottmary was working on the origin of life. And they looked at their equations and they said, they look actually quite similar. So maybe there are some deeper connections here. And they started a project which resulted in a book, on a Nature article on the big transitions from non-life to life, from cellular to multicellular, etc., up to us. That was really the similar processes, a transition so that the dynamics changed. Very fruitful.
And for such things as phase transitions, there are several important things. For example, the phase transition has to nucleate. So you first need to create a sufficiently large community, let's say, of a new species. And then it propagates at the expense of the old community.
Or actually, when a new kind, I'm purposely using the term kind, when a new kind or a strategy or a new type within a species are coming about, for instance, through mutation, it will always be at a low number initially, so the mutant, the deviating strategy will be only few individuals within a large population with many. So it has to be able to invade even when it is small. And by the way, that whole thinking led John Maynard Smith to establish the field of evolutionarily stable strategies using game theory. Well, John was introducing this without knowing that game theory was an established field within economics. He actually introduced this in a book called On Evolution in 1972. He introduced that in the preface. Because, I mean, he didn't, I think he used that he said this is like a game. He didn't use game theory. And then he further developed that. As I said, not really knowing that it was an established field within economics. He soon got to learn this, of course. But he further developed this around this concept of individuals have to be able to invade or deviating strategy has to be able to invade when they are rare compared to the wild type. And if you're not able to, if a strategy is such that it cannot be invaded, it was called evolutionarily stable strategies. Game theorists would call this a Nash equilibrium. But John didn't know about Nash equilibrium, nor did he know about Nash. Well, he might have known about Nash. he might indeed have. But then he developed this together with colleagues to an established field within behavioral ecology or within evolution. Then this was later on taken over to economics again, but in a slightly different form, namely dynamic and evolutionary. So it's very interesting to see how mathematics is facilitating moving concepts into other fields and help other fields answer their question better.
Well, actually, for me, it's really fascinating to see how concepts move both ways, not only from mathematics to biology. Just thinking that biology can be modeled using mathematics, and that we're seriously talking about using concepts of phase transitions for biology, I think not long ago this would be completely unthinkable. But what is also interesting for me, at least equally interesting, is how biology can feed back its ideas into mathematics and computer science. For example, the ideas of evolution are now among the central ideas in many fields of applied mathematics. I use concepts of evolution for predicting crystal structures, for predicting materials with needed properties. For example, if I want to predict the stable structure of a certain substance, for example, carbon, at normal conditions, the stable structure of carbon is graphite. What I do, I create a population of hypothetical random carbon structures. I rank them by energy, and those which have sufficiently low energy, which are sufficiently stable, are given the right to reproduce through crossover and mutations. And then I come up with the next generation of structures with daughter structures. I rank them, and again they mate and mutate. And this is how we obtain crystal structures. Now, what if we want to obtain the best material with the best hardness or electrical conductivity and so on? We can do the same process, selecting the most suitable material with the desired properties, but we can also do it not among a given chemical substance and its different forms, but among all the possible compounds. And then each different chemical compound is viewed as a species, and we run a co-evolution. That's actually what we do. So, different chemical compounds competing with each other, mutating, mating to produce new chemical compounds. This is how computationally we proved recently, just this year, that diamond is the hardest possible substance. Because when you run this large co-evolution in the whole space of all chemical compounds, diamond actually wins this race. But these are concepts entirely borrowed from biology.
There's a lot of borrowing from one field to another and inspiring from one field to another. Traditionally, I believe that mathematicians have been getting much of their inspiration from physics. I think they should start being inspired by biology, because biology is different from physics. So there are many similarities, but they're different. One of the things, of course, is that one entity is producing offspring that resembles itself through genetics, etc., etc. And when discussing this in Moscow is very interesting, because Jakob Sinai, he got the Abel Prize several years ago. I was the president of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters at the time, and Adam Rutherford, he was the moderator when there was a telecom kind of session during the announcement. And Adam was asking Jakob, which field will continue to stimulate mathematics the most? And Jakob said physics. And then Adam repeated, what about biology? It's no interesting. It's not interesting at all. There is nothing to get from biology. Then Jakob came here, and I spent time with the Abel Prize winners, basically 24 hours a day for a whole week, and so we did. And at the last dinner we were together. We sat next to each other. We were chatting about a little bit of everything, including biology, and we talked about the Red Queen. That I adapt to you guys, which worsen your condition, so you have to adapt. And when there are two, it's easy to see that it can settle down. But when there's three or more, it is not very easy to sort of have a gut feeling for the dynamics. And that dinner ended up by saying that, I think there is much interesting mathematics to be done here. And I talked to mathematicians, actually, when I was at the Moscow Festival, only a few months later, that he linked me up to this. So I think biology is a field where mathematicians can get much inspiration for new concepts, new mathematical concepts to be developed, which will, in some cases, not necessarily in all, but in some cases, will help us biologists understand our field and the biology better. And because I cannot imagine to do dynamic biology without mathematicians, I need the input from mathematicians. I need the help from mathematicians.
In fact, now very popular things such as neural networks are also borrowed from biology. Initially, it originated from a work trying to model the workings of the brain, and now we use neural networks pretty much everywhere. For example, in my laboratory, we use neural networks to predict properties of crystals, to replace difficult quantum mechanical equations with analytical solution based on neural networks. These neural networks are now everywhere. And in fact, I was talking recently to some people doing basically computer science. There is much interest in trying to replicate workings of a brain for producing new generation of computers, neuromorphic computers, memory devices, which would be similar to brain's memory with its topology of neurons and synapses, and perhaps even computer itself, which would be like human brain. I think it would be a funny computer, a forgetting computer, a lying computer, but it will be a low power computer. The power consumption of such a computer would be orders of magnitude lower than computers which we use today. And they would be compact. This would be a wonderful computer, although not as reliable as the ones we use today.
I think it would be very rewarding if scientists from different fields came together and entertained this kind of discussions, not only for 1.5 hours, but for longer period. What has to be done then is that we have to understand each other's concept and model thinking in quite some detail in order to really get the interaction going. But if you do, it has lots of fascinating opportunities. So maybe we should start a Moscow colloquium connected to the Moscow Science Festival, where some of us come together and spend a week discussing these issues with the view or with the aim of really trying to move each of our fields further.
This would be wonderful. And I would like to take it seriously and ask the organizers of the Science Festival to consider this.
I've been doing quite a bit of interdisciplinary work over years, and I established a unit here at the University of Oslo, an interdisciplinary group focusing on environment and development. But it was a political decision that it should be interdisciplinary. And it was lots of strange discussions we had. And I left that unit because we had some discussion about the quality of science. There need to be different quality criteria in interdisciplinary science as in disciplinary science. I totally disagree on that, of course, but it was a terrible discussion. So I left that hating the word interdisciplinary. I really hated it. I found it bullshit, really. Sorry for my language here. And I came back to biology, actually around the table I'm sitting at now, with colleagues from partly mathematics, partly statistics, partly biology of different kinds. And suddenly we developed an interdisciplinary group around questions. I was interested in understanding how populations was changing in time, high, low density in time and space. I was interested in describing that. I was interested in understanding the underlying dynamics. So focusing around questions is the key, I think, to bring different disciplines or approaches in different disciplines together. So do take this seriously. I'm very serious about this myself.
I also think this is sort of an excellent idea, and there is something also about, let's say, mathematics that is useful to the mind in some sense. It tends to sharpen what you focus on, and it also helps you often transfer insights from one domain to another domain, or and that can also be within one domain, that you sort of you look at the process, and by formulating that process in some way mathematically, it's easier to see how it relates to different processes because of the abstraction you can do through mathematics. And of course in physics and other fields, this has helped enormously in physics to understand how various processes are related. But I think this is sort of, it's an important tool, but it's a tool that of course needs to be used then within the boundaries or within the bounds of the various disciplines in some sense. It's but it can help you also translate between different disciplines, because it's sort of a language that's well suited for generalization.
And it focuses your ideas very much when you write down a mathematical formula you have to be much more precise than you otherwise have. That's why I always say that whenever, I basically always say we should formulate this or that mathematically in some sort of equation. And I always say that we should not, biologists, they are very afraid of mathematical formulation. They are very afraid of that. So they very often put the equations into the supplementary. I said, no, it shall be in the main text, at least the basic key concept put together in a mathematical structure. Then the details can be in the supplementary. But in order to really understand what we're all talking about, it has to be in the main text.
But Niels, I also believe that there is a change in bioscience that's gradually happening where there is a larger demand for some type of modeling or understanding or explanation. So if you want to have, let's say, an article accepted in a really high impact journal, it's not enough just to provide observations, or it is.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. There's a tremendous change. Artem, you mentioned that it was a strange combination of mind back in the 70s, combining mathematics and zoology. I was actually, I was the only one in the world, I think. So I was working in population dynamics in lemmings, and whenever they organized a meeting about the dynamics of lemmings and small rodents, they wanted to have one talking about mathematics and modeling, and I was the only one. So I was, invited to all sorts of settings. Now there are many, and there are many very clever, doing, partly having their training from mathematics, or partly coming out of biology with solid understanding of biology. I was actually accepted to the doctoral program. To the master degree program without having the necessary requirement in biology. But I had the necessary requirement in mathematics, and there was a regulation at the time that you could enter biology if you, without having all the requirement in biology, but if you had the equivalent for chemistry, or physics, or mathematics, you could enter, and I had it in mathematics.
Niels, there's something I'd like to ask you, because I think there's a very fascinating story on sort of the importance or use of modeling and mathematics in what you have been doing on the plague. In particular, as far as I remember, you had an explanation for how you were able to determine what was transmitting the plague, that in parts also was dependent on how you were modeling how the plague was being transmitted.
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, but let me give you a short version of a long story. I've done a lot of work on how climate variation is affecting ecological and biological systems. I've done this for rodents, I've done it for deer, I've done it for various fish species, I've done it for mushrooms, etc., etc. A lot. I'm proud of all of this work, but it became boring because there was not anything new concepts coming out of it. It was the same. The species name was different, but basically the same. I mean, the mathematical use was exactly the same. So I wanted to change and study disease system, a human disease system, but in order to understand the dynamics in the human, you really had to understand the dynamics out in wilderness. And people said you should start with malaria. I said no way I'm going to start on malaria, because there are so many good people there, so it's very hard to sort of make a niche there. And by chance, I got access to Soviet Union monitoring data on plague in wildlife. And it was very difficult data to understand. That is a gold mine. So we were the first one actually studying the plague system out in the wildlife, studying how the host dynamic was. The host was gerbils and others, small rodents, but gerbils I was focusing on. And they're being transmitted between the individuals by fleas, the vector, and doing statistical modeling and mathematical modeling, we come to the understanding that the host density had to be high over a couple of years in order to have an outbreak. Then if the rodent population, the gerbil population crashed, we saw another threshold, that it jumped, the plague jumped over to other species. Again, it was statistical modeling linked to mathematical modeling, and that was the key in our understanding. lots of people had access to these data. Not lots of people, but some people, even smart people, had access to this data, but they've never really been able to see any structure because they didn't use a mathematical framework for asking the question statistically. So I think mathematics played a key role there.
And the importance of the population density brings me back to this issue of phase transitions. The individuals have to be strongly interacting within the population in order for the phase transition to happen. And infection is a kind of phase transition.
Yeah, exactly. There has to be enough individuals in order to make the dynamics within the bacteria population.
When you have a rare population, low density population, it's more like a gas. Exactly. And when they are,
if I may,
like crystal.
If I may come back to the interaction between different species, in the plague system, we see how genes in the bacteria are controlling the behavior of the flea transmitting the bacteria between individuals. If the host population is increasing and high, there is no need to have any particular behavior in the flea. But if it is crushing, so it's becoming rare, it is to the bacteria's interest to make sure that the flea can move around and be infective for a long time. So the bacteria is generating a microfilm, so that the flea don't understand that it has been already having a meal, so it goes to another host and have another food, and then don't realize it had had a meal, etc., etc. Maximizing, and this is, by the way, the extended phenotype of Richard Dawkins, published originally in 1982. Again, this is concept that is very mathematical. If you do mathematics, it's much easier to sort of make predictions of what kind of dynamic changes. Without mathematics, it's become hand-waving only.
No, there is another important concept that also comes from phase transitions, and that is related to the size of the fluctuations and what happens when you try to calculate averages. And this is something that often has worried us, sort of coming from physics, because you've seen the misuse of various terms sometimes. I mean, some of the background of the financial crisis around 2008, 2009 was often a mispricing of various types of financial instruments. And why? Because you essentially took the average over many instruments, and then you assume that either they were independent, so that they were sort of the sum of many independent variables, and sometimes you also assume that they were normally distributed. And this is something that we assume that things are distributed according to a Gaussian, and then things work very fine, because if you sum things that are Gaussian, have a Gaussian distribution, then you end up with a Gaussian distribution. But close to a phase transition, if you look at various sort of the behavior of the system, what you see there is that you have very large fluctuations. And these really large fluctuations, they don't average out, because they don't have, so what we say sort of formally is that they don't have a finite standard deviation. And this is sort of a quite deep problem, because it's so, we are so used to just being able to sum things and take the average of many individuals, and then the average will be nicely behaved. Versus if you're in this situation where you have large fluctuations, which might be close to where you have, let's say an evolutionary event in some sense, a large evolutionary fluctuations, then averaging doesn't really work. So you should be careful.
I totally agree, and I agree for many reasons. One of them being that what is evolutionarily optimal at one ecological condition, at one density, might not be evolutionarily optimal at another. Or for that matter, when the population is increasing, there might be one optimal strategy, whereas when it's decreasing, it's another one. And the extended phenotype issue I told you about is one example of that. And we were only able to discover this. This was in Chinese data to the border of Kazakhstan. They had 40-year long-term data on the population, on the dynamics of the population. They had the density of the gerbils, but it was actually ground squirrels at that site. The vector and the bacteria. And for the bacteria, they had specimens stored. So now when you can do genomics, they did genomics 40-year long time series of sequencing. And then we saw genes that was coding for biofilm formation, primarily appearing in the decrease phase. And we had very great difficulties in really making sense out of that until we got the concept right. Well, actually, the concept that worked, that extended phenotypes. What was going on in the bacteria was not primarily directly affecting the bacteria, but primarily affecting the flea, so as to maximize the fitness of the bacteria under the current condition. So averaging is very, very dangerous, very dangerous.
And it's also quite it's sort of relevant in these times, because if you want to model, let's say, the spread of a disease, what you often assume is that there is like an average number of people that one person can infect. So if you assume that number of people that you can infect, if you assume that has a Gaussian distribution, it means that you typically might be able to infect, let's say, 10 people, but being able to infect 100 people is going to have an extremely low probability. Versus if you think more of this phase transition thinking, then you'd have instead a power law, which means that it's like the earthquakes in some sense, that yes, you do have sort of some rare earthquakes, but they do actually occur. You do actually have these large fluctuations. And if you have a lot of people, like in a model for the spreading of an infection, then these rare events can become very important. So sometimes it becomes very practical. It becomes very important as to how you what type of model do you want to introduce? Do you introduce, let's say, an agent-based model where you model the individuals and their network of connections, or do you look at it on an average? And sometimes these differences can be really large. And here I think there are interesting, and might be interesting things to learn from the way that we are modeling things in physics, also when it comes to infectious disease, for instance, and there might be other applications in that.
And in game theory, within biology, we see examples of that. Sometimes you can have a mix of strategies that is the optimum one. A mix of strategies within any given individual or in the population. Sometimes only within individuals is working. Sometimes the split one is. So averaging is very, very difficult, because different things is happening at various population levels or in various different states.
Another thing, Niels, that really fascinates me and is this enormous compression of information that goes on through, let's say, when you transmit information from one generation to the next generation, there's an enormous compression in some sense of information. I mean, we're all quite complicated individuals, but we are described by not that many variables in the end.
Mm-hmm.
This enormous compression, it means that there must be some things are sort of compressed and expanded in terms of various physical processes, so understanding sort of this compression of information is something that at least I, as a physicist, find extremely fascinating. And
it's the genes that is taken from one generation to the other, and the different genes has a different possibility or probability of being of moving from one generation to another, depending on how well the phenotype is doing. So here we have two different levels. You have the molecular genetic level that transmit the information from one generation to another. Not exactly. There are some random mutation, and there are some non-random changes due to selection.
Niels, actually, capitalizing on the question by Anders, I have to confess my ignorance about one very important, I guess, thing in biology. DNA that we carry in our cells is the same in every cell.
The same
why do my skin cells differ from my liver or heart or muscle cells? How do they differentiate when a human was just a one-cell fetus and many cells appeared by division of the cells? How did the differentiation happen?
Well, I'm not a specialist on this, but different genes are being expressed in different parts of the body. And they can interact, actually. The expression can interact. And the tiger, I mean, the stripes on the tiger is of that kind. I mean, it's the same genetic material under the cells where the stripes is black, as under where it is yellow. So it's the location that depends, and the relative location that depends. Mathematician has actually worked on that issue.
But how do the cells know where they should express black and where they should express yellow?
I personally don't know.
Okay, I thought I am the only one who doesn't know this.
There is their location relative to other cells that are doing other behavior, and through evolution, of course, they have been coordinated so as to make the full body.
But how do you include this information in the DNA? So the DNA is just one molecule. How does it know that next to yellow should be black and that liver should be below the heart and not the other way around?
But again, I can't answer this question. But it's one way of thinking. It's similar to interaction between individuals. They have to relate to each other in some optimal way. That has been obtained. What is optimal has been obtained through natural selection. So it's really the interaction between, and here we come to the different transition. And this is back to Urs Schottmarie and John Maynard Smith, the big transition. And you partly had individual cells that was living independent of each other and behaving as a population relative to the other cells. Then it became multicellular organisms where they exactly had to coordinate themselves to make a whole function better together than each of them would do by himself. So we
by the way, about multicellular
into this discussion also next time.
By the way, about multicellular organisms and geology and the link of everything with everything. Recently, I was collaborating with some geologists, trying to paint a broad brush picture of the evolution of the Earth. So I added their material science part, and they added various geological and paleontological evidence. And it was very interesting. It was actually very educational. It turns out from the variety of evidence that we have that about 2.3, 2.4 billion years ago, the Earth underwent through a major change. The atmosphere, which before then was rich in methane and was highly reducing, about 2.4 billion years ago, plus minus, became oxidized. So oxygen appeared, free oxygen appeared in the atmosphere. And this must have killed an awful lot of organisms which were anaerobic. And only those organisms which were photosynthetic or could adapt to the oxygen, only those organisms could survive. And then actually paleontologists, biologists link the appearance of oxygen in the atmosphere to the appearance of multicellular organisms. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what is exactly the link, but they do think that only after oxygen appeared, multicellular organisms emerged. Probably, I don't know. This is just my
Anders might know something about this.
Probably because it was such a huge stress on the living populations that they started to do crazy things, and one of the crazy things was to join together. That's just my imagination of how this could happen.
Or I would put it differently: if the working together is a multicellular, give you higher fitness under the new situation, they will have.
And here is also a related question. When we do evolutionary algorithms on the computer, we have a predefined fitness. We have a stable, fixed physical environment. We want the lowest energy, or we want the highest electrical conductivity material. And then we try through different possibilities, improve them through evolution to get to that highest fitness. In biological evolution, fitness changes all the time. The physical environment changes. In the beginning, there was no oxygen. Then all of a sudden, you have to adapt to oxygen. It's a game with changing rules. It's like if you play cards with a crook who changes the rules as the game proceeds. I wonder, has this point been studied by biologists, and what are the conclusions?
Within this literature focusing on the Gaia hypothesis, where you actually see the interaction between the physical environment and the biotic environment and how they are interacting. So they are actually, some people are working on this. But I wanted to touch on another one. We are very usually we are thinking about evolution as a process that you only see the changes over thousands of years. That need not be so. If the selective pressure is very strong, evolution will go very fast. And we do believe we are seeing evolutionary changes in the fish population, the cod, the Atlantic cod off the coast of or in the Atlantic Ocean. Since the Second World War, the fisherman strategy has changed from harvesting the fish where they are spawning to harvesting the fish where they are before they are spawning. And they do this science selectively, so they take the big guys, they capture the big guys before they are able to spawn. So the small guys, they are able to go to the spawning ground, and because they are not caught. And we believe that we are seeing an evolutionary change over a few decades, that the small guys are becoming more common, and the guys that are maturing earlier are becoming more common. And that is an evolutionary response, because when you are being caught before you are able to reproduce, you leave no progeny after you. Whereas if you are able to leave progeny on the spawning ground, you do leave. That's how the genetic composition of the whole population is changing. And this is over only a few tens of years.
Amazing. Amazing.
Could I ask you something, Nils? Because we started to discuss this this idea that data now, we are gaining more data, and that this is sort of gradually changing the various sciences, and I agree with you. It's sort of a very exciting time to be working in the science because of this revolution. But
I suddenly realized that my battery is going out. Can I go and get a cord? Continue to do.
Yep. And I guess we are both seeing this to some degree, Artem, in that I mean, from what you are saying, also you're using now this large data approaches to scan through enormous amounts of possible types of chemical configurations in order to find the optimal one. Are you to some degree also looking for them, or are you only that is sort of looking for how they occur in nature, or are you sort of just looking for what we can produce? Are you sort of, because there's an area of chemistry which is called something like biologically inspired chemical engineering, for instance, where you could sort of start to look for things.
For me, evolution is an algorithm to solve a mathematical problem, a complex mathematical problem which you could not solve just by trying all possibilities on the computer. This would take you longer than the age of the universe. But this huge global optimization problem can be solved in a reasonably short amount of time thanks to evolution. So for me, evolution is just a mathematical trick. But I can tell you that there are already hypotheses that even inorganic matter in the universe evolves with time. So inorganic matter also competes, and organic matter also tends to the state with the lowest free energy. And all these rearrangements, all these reactions, transformations that occur there, they also are in order to maximize fitness.
Yeah, and now when we have all this data that we are gathering with computer science, machine learning, what have you, we are able to actually answer some of these questions.
So, but my question to you, Niels, was sort of, I just started that was, we have all of this data. Where do you think sort of where do you think this will have the largest impact in ecology, for instance? Or evolutionary biology, this data revolution?
Yeah, I think it will help us link micro and macro evolution together. It will help us understand the interaction of ecology and genetics in what makes or facilitates speciation, and what promote extinction, what makes you more extinct prone, to really understand that. As I said early on, we do understand evolution within a species pretty well, but we do not understand the issue of speciation. We do not understand the process of extinction, but we do understand that depending on the biodiversity, extinction will be faster or slower because of competition for resources. But which of the individuals, which of the species are more or less prone is basically an empirical question. So partly linking the two together and understanding the macro evolutionary changes or processes. A very good friend of mine, Thomas Hansen here, he says that microevolution we understand, macroevolution is everything else that we don't understand. And to a certain extent, this is true.
So following up on that, Niels, if you were to give advice to a young student who wants to have a career in, let's say, evolutionary biology, what would you say to that student? What should he or she what type of skills and knowledge would be useful?
Well, I would say exactly what my study advisor in high school did say to me. That teacher, he was my teacher in mathematics. He was my teacher in biology. And he knew that I was interested in mathematics. He knew I was interested in biology. So it was not clear to me whether I should become a mathematician or a biologist. But it was pretty clear to me that I really wanted biology, but I wasn't sure. Then my study advisor, my teacher, said to me, Niels, you start at university, you start with mathematics, you prepare yourself for doing a master degree in mathematics. At that point, you jump over to biology, because the other way is much more difficult. I would advise a student that was interested in both mathematics and biology and to do that. And a student that was interested in primarily biology, evolutionary biology, I would say, do make sure you get some good, solid knowledge of dynamic theory before you really start your biological work. That would be my advice.
I wonder where will mathematics and physics take the next inspiration? My feeling is that biology could provide such a rich ground of ideas, because biology for a long, long time was far from hard sciences. You know, I'm not yet really old, but when I was a student, when I was a PhD student, physicists, chemists were pointing at zoology, saying that zoology is not a science. It's just a catalog of the names of animals. That tiger has stripes and rat has teeth and dog barks. That was zoology for them. Now we see quantitative mathematics-rich zoology. So now we see genetics. Now we see, you know, advancing at huge strides. We see all this fascinating development of biology, and it is doing so well that it actually feeds back into physics and mathematics. And now we have neural networks, evolutionary algorithms.
There is a tremendous change in biology over the last 100 or couple of 100 years. Linné, he was classifying organisms, and that was quite a lot of botany and zoology was that, to classify and to describe. You know, some of these organisms, they were more similar to others, so there were some families, there were some orders, you know, but it was very descriptive. Darwin, however, he talks about dynamics, and that's where mathematics comes in, or the necessity of mathematics. You know, really seeing the pattern between different species, linear, you will need some mathematics too. But really where mathematics comes heavily in is when you start talking about dynamics.
Of course, but I wonder where mathematics and physics and perhaps chemistry will take the next inspiration from. Right now we have plenty of scientific disciplines at which mathematicians and physicists point fingers and say this is not science. For example, geology is one. If you ask physicists what is geology, a lot of them will say that geologists are those people with hammers who go to the mountains. And by the way, this is not true anymore. Just like Darwin appeared already well before people were pointing fingers at biology. Now geologists use quantitative modeling quite a lot. I know because I do it too. I have a lot of works related to science. Anders is doing physics in geology. That's his job description. And perhaps geology will provide this inspiration to mathematics, physics, chemistry, or perhaps sociology or psychology, or I don't know what, economics perhaps. Or maybe philosophy, I don't know.
I think mathematics is important. Mathematics is important whenever A influence B, influence C, which influence A again. That kind of system, and the more complicated they are, the more needs there will be for mathematics. That is the feedback loops. And often these feedbacks are at different time scales, because the interacting organisms, the interacting units are very often having different generation time. And it's very, very hard. It's very hard to have the, you know, intuitive feelings around that. But mathematics can help you there. I'm sure. I'm convinced of that.
Absolutely. So these sciences probably were a little bit too hard for mathematics to crack on early on. But now as mathematics develops, as our intuition develops, and as these sciences develop, the synthesis of these sciences with mathematics becomes more and more realistic. And then probably completely new paradigms will come into science, like evolution did.
I do quite a bit of joint publication with mathematician and statistician, and then we have the following strategy. We publish this in good journals in biology, as well as good journals in either statistics or in mathematics. Biology, because you know, I'm interested in biological issues, but I'm also interested in attracting the interest from mathematician and statistician in their home garden. So there's a strategy for me.
So you are initiating a phase transition in mathematics as well as in biology.
I'm trying this in a selfish way to help us understand biology better. But if I can, get you on board, fantastic. Fantastic.
But I think an important principle often in this type of collaborations is that there needs to be something interesting for all parties.
Exactly.
I think it's very important to find areas also in let's say in evolution then that mathematicians, for instance, find interesting because they raise interesting problems in mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is often what is really hard if you want to have a long ongoing, let's say, interdisciplinary collaboration, is to be able to find these problems that are at the forefront of several disciplines at one time. Because if you do mathematics, you don't sort of want to be doing, you don't want to be an engineer that solves the problems that somebody else are posing. You would like to take part in posing the questions, because this is what we often find the most interesting as scientists.
When I'm putting together teams of mathematicians and biologists, it is very important to me that the mathematician is not the research assistant for the biologist, nor the biologist the research assistant for the mathematician. We should make sure that the mathematicians see uniquely interesting things coming out of this work, as well as the biologist should see uniquely interesting things within his or her field. I think it's very, very important. Otherwise, you don't get the good people working. You get the losers working on this. They might be good work, but not for advancing, making this big transitions.
Okay, our time is almost up. Do we have any questions coming in? Well, if there are no questions, I hope everyone had fun. I personally enjoyed this discussion tremendously, and I agree with Niels that we should continue this and probably expand the format. Oh, I'm sorry.
Next science conference, Moscow Science Conference, we should have the Moscow colloquium in mathematics and evolutionary biology.
I very much like this idea, and I think this idea, if we could identify and gather together open-minded people, could actually generate a lot of unexpected results.
I totally agree.
Okay, thank you very much, and everyone have a nice day.
Thank you very, very much. See you then in Moscow next year.
See you next year.
Thank you. Hope to see you next year. Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
В жизни всегда есть место открытиям. Откройте Web Gallery.
Встречай Сбер, твой банк. А еще Сбер — это целая вселенная с универсальным доступом. Легко и просто. Выгодная подписка. На все сразу. Салют. Умный ассистент поможет выбрать фильм на вечер, поговорить о жизни.
А ты хороша.
Спасибо за комплимент, Андрей.
А еще доставим, накормим, довезем,
Что-то еще?
отправим, сориентируем, поможем бизнесу взлететь. С нами 100 миллионов клиентов. Такое кино, такие новости, такой звук. Сбер. Больше, чем банк. Сбер для жизни.
Что снимать в TikTok Live? Да что угодно. Сними, как тебя разбудило солнце, или как ты разбудил соседей. Сними свой завтрак, или тех, кто не дает тебе позавтракать. Покажи привычный вид из окна, или вид, к которому не можешь привыкнуть. Увлекаешься чем-то? Покажи это. Просто снимай, а зрители найдутся. Снимай, если на работе произошло что-то интересное. Или твоя работа — это и есть что-то интересное. Покажи, как пропадаешь дома. Покажи, куда едешь. Или почему пришлось остановиться. Покажи что-то новое. Покажи неизменную классику. Покажи тренировки. И покажи результат. Покажи семью. Покажи друзей. Ведь твоя реальная жизнь — это и есть самый невероятный контент. Покажи, чем ты живешь. Посмотри, чем я живу. TikTok Live.
Границы Вселенной, скорость мысли, невидимые миры, абсолютный ноль. Все это не просто слова. Это телеканал «Наука». Нам есть чем вас удивить.